We met today for a good portion of the morning, both in full committee meetings, and I had a couple of private discussions in a small group with Gary to continue what we started the other day. The players completed the rest of their economic proposals, economic player contracting proposals more precisely. Having said that, there was, in almost every case, these were items that had been previously mentioned and discussed, just perhaps not put forward with the requisite formality that we did today. During the morning, our conversation suggested mutually that the parties would be better served by taking the time between now and Tuesday to review where we are, to work internally on various things, and then to meet again on Tuesday in New York and to focus on the core economic issues going forward. And so that's the plan. And hopefully it will be productive when we get to it. We have a lot to do. I have always believed that there's enough time. If there's a mutual will to do that, I still believe there's enough time to do that before the expiration of the contract. And that's, as some of you know, not a date that we consider magic in any event.
Don, what did you present in terms of contract issues or contract rights to them?
The question was, what did we present in terms of contract issues? We talked about a number of things. I won't go through all of them. One, for example, was bringing the postseason players pool back to the level it was before the lockout. As some of you may know, what an NHL player gets for winning the cup on the team distribution is vastly smaller than what they get in the other sports for their respective championships. And this comes out of the players pool anyway, so it's not a major cost item. It's not a cost item to the owners at all. We talked about waiver rules. We talked about the college draft. We talked about a couple of items related to buyouts and 7 or 8 other things, maybe more than that. Again, all items that had been mentioned before.
But I mean, the big issues are terms of contracts, front signing bonuses, and free agency, I would presume, right?
Yes, and we had some things to say about that. We've previously given a response on that. There's no misunderstanding between the parties as to what the relative positions are. And we have to see. As some of you may know, players believe that everyone is better served by having more flexibility putting teams together. The owners appear not to, which makes them relatively unusual. Every other business in North America wants as much flexibility and as little regulation as possible, but sports, tends to be a little different, as some of you may know.
The commissioner said he thinks that you need to solve the core economic issue, the system, HRR, before getting to that secondary stuff. Do you share that belief?
Well, our belief is that, and I think they share what I'm about to say, by the way, even if we come at it from different perspectives, is that when you tie together the core economic issues in terms of the cap numbers, when you add to that the revenue sharing issues, when you add to that the player contracting issues, we don't separate them. And we have different approaches as to what makes sense and what needs to be tackled first. Having said that, they all have to be agreed upon or it's not going to be agreed upon. And so when we say we're going to focus on core economic issues next week, I expect that sooner or later we'll get to all of those. Exactly what's going to come up first, I don't know yet.
Don, Gary said that we believe we're paying more out than we should. That pretty much crystallizes their position. Where does the union stand on that?
Well, it's sort of interesting. I'm not sure there's any employer that wouldn't like a salary reduction in what it pays people, including all of you with microphones and with cameras, and including everybody that watches or listens to this broadcast or reads about it in press. Everybody understands that employers would always like to pay less. So, that's not a surprise to anybody. It's disappointing sometimes, but it's not a surprise. Secondly, if we go back to where we were at the end of the last lockout, we know that the players' fair market value, meaning what the owners would pay in the aggregate if they didn't have the restrictions of the cap, is vastly above the current agreement, much less than what we have now. From the player standpoint, they want a fair agreement. They want one that is equitable. They want one that recognizes their contribution. And I think you have to remember that they're not only the most important people here, by which I mean no one watches anybody else, okay? You can take everybody in suits, including the person now speaking to you out, and replace them tomorrow. Fans aren't going to notice the difference. You take out the players, they notice the difference.
Have the owners?
And so you start from that standpoint, and the question is, can we find a way to accommodate everybody's interests? We'll find out.
Have the owners attempted to justify why players should be paid less?
I think you have to talk to them about that. Essentially what they've said is that the players in football and basketball took less, and we've reminded them, first of all, that every sport has its own economics, and asked them if the basketball players got a higher percentage, would they be proposing a higher percentage? And of course they said no. And secondly, we reminded them that the only sport which is stable is baseball. It has no cap. It has very extensive revenue sharing, and it has zero labor relations problems the last 16 years. In the cap sports, they've had nothing but lockouts. So, that's not something they didn't know, of course, but you asked how they justify it. That's essentially what they've pointed to, plus some suggestions about how their economics are working out. We've listened to what they have had to say. That's why the players made the proposal that they did. And we'll go from there.
Mr. Fehr, the owners say that there's parts of the deal that they were looking at that they might have liked. What parts were they in your proposal, and does that give you reason to be optimistic?
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I'm glad to hear there's some things that perhaps they can work with. I'll wait to see what they come back with. I don't want to characterize it. I think that would be inappropriate at this stage and possibly counterproductive, so we'll wait for them to do it.
Is it your honest belief that they're really negotiating in advance of a lockout, or are they kind of waiting?
Question is it my honest belief that they're really negotiating in advance of a lockout? Well, the answer is I hope so. And when we get to the point where we either reach an agreement or don't, I'm sure I'll have a much more certain view about that. But I don't make predictions. I've told you that before.
Well,
and we will.
That's an opinion.
No, I know.
Different.
But and we'll have to see. Let me amend it this way. I'm not going to make that judgment unless and until I have to, and I don't have to make it now, and I certainly hope they are.
Don, if you guys are as far apart as Gary says you are in terms of the core economic number and the ancillary issues, and there's no pressure on this until paychecks are lost or games are lost and someone's losing money somewhere, what's going to move these negotiations along? What makes you believe that it can get done before the season starts?
Well, look, let me say a couple of things in response to that. If there's going to be a lockout, and that's something that the owners will choose or not choose, then you would have missed games, you would have lost revenue, you would have lost paychecks, okay? But that doesn't mean that the parties don't understand going into it that would be the case. So, you have to see.
Gary says he'll do homework the next 4 days leading up to Tuesday. What will your group be doing those next 4 days?
Well, that's Gary's description for it, and I'm certainly not going to quarrel with it. Let me describe the process for you a little bit. In my experience, what happens is you go through bargaining, you make proposals, you listen to counter proposals, you have discussion. You try and see how all the various pieces fit together. You have, on our side at least, and I'm pretty confident on their side too, continuing conversations with your constituents about how things look and what we might be able to do and all the rest of it. And sometimes the process is better served rather than by meeting and continuing the discussions, by taking time to think and consider, to ponder, to talk to your respective constituents, and then to come back. And the time that's going to be taken between now and then is hopefully going to be taken on both sides to do that. Whether it'll be productive remains to be seen, but it's certainly not unusual for that to happen.
With having a smaller meeting scheduled for Tuesday, as you had yesterday morning, do you think there's a chance it's a little more productive than if there's a lot of people in the room?
Look, the short answer is that when you get into discussions like this, sometimes things can become a little more or less cumbersome depending on the nature of the group and what you're talking about. And, you find a way to satisfy everybody's comfort level and go on. And if you try it one way and it doesn't really work, you go try it another way. And if that doesn't work, you try it a third way. The nature of that group may, after it's over, say, well, this allowed for a discussion we couldn't have had otherwise, but that's pretty difficult to predict ahead of time. But that's basically the way it is. Okay? Thanks, everyone.